I'm Mark Berzonsky, your host for Mideast Realities. Edward Said is one of the most profound thinkers, writers, and commentators of our time. One of the most influential humanists of our generation is how he is introduced in just a few moments. He also happens to be Palestinian. Born in Jerusalem, Said's family fled to Cairo when the civil war between Jews and Arabs broke out in British Mandate Palestine after World War II. Then, as a boy, he came to the United States. Said is one of the best-known professors at Columbia University, where he holds a distinguished and endowed chair in English comparative literature. As you will hear in the upcoming introduction, he has held nearly every major fellowship known to man or beast, and has delivered some 27 endowed lectures. Said is in demand throughout the world at major universities, not only in the field of literature, but as a social critic and political analyst. Though in his early years at Columbia, Said was not greatly politically involved, he became more and more so in the 70s and 80s. He was, in fact, a prominent member of the Palestine National Council during the time when the PLO was most ostracized and vilified in the U.S. In recent years, especially since the Gulf War and the agreements that followed between Israel and what was the PLO, Edward Said has become one of the most outspoken dissenters from and critics of U.S. foreign policy, Yasser Arafat, and developments in the Middle East region. Said's books and articles have been widely published throughout the world in many languages. Orientalism, published in 1978, is considered a defining treatise on the subject of Western cultural and social imperialism. In this series of 4 Mideast Realities programs, we are very pleased to be able to bring you one of Edward Said's most interesting and provocative recent lectures. The title of the lecture is The Clash of Civilizations, and Said delivered it at the University of Wisconsin in Madison in November of '95. What Said discusses is, of course, much broader than just contemporary Middle East events. But what he discusses is actually of considerable importance in providing the vital background necessary to really appreciate these events and put them in historical perspective. And during the lecture, and even more so in the question and answer period, Said specifically comments about Israeli-Palestinian developments in the past few years, comments that are of extreme importance and should be very carefully pondered.
Good evening. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce to you tonight one of the most influential humanists of our generation. As I look out at this remarkably full auditorium, 1,300 of you, if I've counted correctly, and perhaps more in the overflow room, let me first assure you that you've done the right thing in choosing to come to this event tonight. This, I guarantee you, is an evening you will long remember. I assure each and every one of you that you will leave this hall with new thoughts, new insights, new ways of looking at old issues. In looking at the brilliant career of Professor Edward Said, I think we can examine his impact around 3 major themes. Perhaps the best known of them arises from his now classic 1978 book entitled Orientalism. This work offered a far-reaching critique of the 19th century French, German, and British scholars who constructed the Orient in the Western mind. Said, in this work, unravels the hidden assumptions of Western superiority which permeated their work, and shows how Islam was constructed through these works as a negative other against which a triumphant Christian West was defined. He also demonstrates the use of these writings as a rationale for imperialism by representing the other as enshrouded in a flawed and fossilized culture. He shows as well how these notions were embedded in Western scholarship reproduced in the works of more contemporary scholars. In his second major kind of contribution, he extends and develops some of the themes introduced in Orientalism, most notably in his prize-winning 1993 book, Culture and Imperialism. In this work, he extends some of the insights of Orientalism to Western literature and art more broadly, not simply Western studies of the Orient, the East, and shows how deeply in literature and art having to do with the colonial venture, imperialist premises had been embedded. The reviewer in the New York Times characterized this work as a masterful synthesis of a field which he, Professor Said, had largely created. A third and quite different theme in his scholarship is as a vocal and eloquent defender of Palestinian rights. This line of inquiry is expressed in various works: Question of Palestine, published in 1979, The Politics of Dispossession, The Struggle for Palestinian Self-Determination in 1994, and in innumerable contributions of current commentary in leading political reviews, newspapers, and so forth. He has been not only a commentator, but also a participant in what we might call the construction of the Palestinian idea, but never in an exclusivist fashion. That his defense of Palestinian rights has always been incorporated in a more ecumenical vision of the necessity of encounter between Arabs and Jews who share that land. There are many other dimensions to Professor Said I might mention. Let me also note that he is, among other things, a musician, and in 1991 published through Columbia University Press a volume on a totally different line of humanist scholarship, musical elaborations. The influence and impact of Professor Said on the whole field of cultural studies and literary theory has been simply immense. But not only in these fields, also in humanist and social science scholarship more broadly, in a range of fields from history to anthropology to political science. It is simply impossible not to come to terms with the work of Edward Said. He is then enormous in his impact. He is also very large in his provocation. Needless to say, those scholars who were harpooned in Orientalism fought back. Bernard Lewis most notably and most tenaciously. I recollect a debate here in Madison shortly after Orientalism was published, a quite heated exchange between four persons, two of whom were strong partisans, two of whom were equally forceful critics of the theoretical orientation of Orientalism. Professor Said has also been a provocateur with respect to what one might call as the more extreme of postmodernist thought. He remains deeply committed to humanism and not prepared to join in those who would simply deconstruct it. He has been as well a provocateur in his role as a participant in the Palestinian national movement. He did serve from 1977 till 1991 as a member of the Palestinian National Council, officially the ruling body of the Palestinian movement, but he has often been critical of the lack of internal democracy in the Palestine Liberation Organization, and he has been sharply critical of the peace accords recently signed by that organization, which in his analysis and understanding fall far short of the minimum required to give protection to Palestinian rights. He has also been a provocateur vis-a-vis certain extremist elements in Israeli opinion. He's received a number of death threats emanating from such sources. 1990, a New York radio station received a hit list, including Edward Said, from a political religious extreme organization by the name of Kant, quite similar to arising from the same milieu as those that are responsible for the killing of Yitzhak Rabin. That event of the last fortnight, shows that such threats have to be taken very seriously. Now, how did he get to where he now is? The pathway began in Jerusalem, then part of the Palestine Mandate under British rule in 1935. He came to the United States at the age of 15, 1950, became a naturalized citizen in 1953, received his BA at Princeton and then his PhD at Harvard. I discovered that he and I were, although we never met, were in the Widener Library together for the same period of time from 59 to 63. Since then, he has held professorial positions at Columbia University. He now holds a distinguished endowed chair in English and comparative literature. He has, as far as I could discern, held every major fellowship known to man or beast. Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Science, mind you, not cultural studies, at Stanford. The National Endowment for the Humanities, the Guggenheim Foundation, the Social Science Research Council, among others. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is the author of 13 books translated into 8 languages. And in addition to all of these things, he has been practicing for his performance tonight. Practicing in the form of 27 major endowed lectures that he has given, and lectures at well over 100 universities in the United States, Canada, the Arab world, United Kingdom, South Africa, and doubtless other places. Which brings me to the title of tonight's lecture: Clash of Civilizations or Clash of Definitions. Behind that title, you can see, I'm sure, looming the long shadow of Professor Samuel Huntington of Harvard University, whose controversial and provocative article, Clash of Civilizations, which appeared in Foreign Affairs about 3 years ago, seemingly provides the theme for this evening's lecture. I have not seen his advanced text, but we can anticipate that Professor Said will comment on what could be readily seen as a kind of neo-Orientalist theory of world conflict in that article, by which Huntington proposes a series of civilizational entities which, according to this article, would define future lines of international rivalry now that state socialism and Marxism-Leninism are dead. As I say, I have not seen the text, but I rather suspect that Professor Huntington, my good friend, would squirm were he in the audience tonight, which I believe he is not. Thank you, Professor Said.
It's hard hard to know how to live up to that extraordinary introduction by Professor Young. I'm very grateful to him for his generosity and extremely happy to be here this evening. I'm also very appreciative of the efforts of the various members of the lectures committees that made my presence here possible. And I shall begin by saying that I wish Samuel Huntington were in the audience so that he could squirm in front of you. Indeed, Professor Young is a very clever man, and he's quite right. I am going to talk about this essay by Huntington, which appeared in Foreign Affairs magazine in the summer of 1993, and announced in its first sentence, and I quote, that world politics is entering a new phase. By this, Huntington meant that whereas in the recent past, world conflicts were between ideological camps grouping the first, second, and third worlds into warring entities, the new style of politics would entail conflicts between different and presumably clashing civilizations. I quote again, "The great divisions among humankind and the dominating source of conflict will be cultural. The clash of civilizations will dominate global politics." Later in the same article, he explains how it is that the principal clash will be between Western and non-Western civilizations, and indeed, Huntington spends most of his time in the article discussing the fundamental disagreements, potential or actual, between what he calls the West on the one hand. And by the way, he never defines the West, he just says the West, so if everybody knows what that is. And on the other hand, the conflict between the West and on the other hand, Islamic and Confucian civilizations. And indeed, one of the amusing aspects of this article is that he keeps warning us about some alliance between Islam and Confucianism, which I don't think anybody's seen or heard of. But it's part of the brilliance of the argument that it allows itself insights that are afforded no one else. In terms of detail, however, it's important to note, just statistically, that a great deal more attention is paid to Islam in Huntington's article than to any other civilization that he talks about, including even the West. Now, much of the subsequent interest taken in Huntington's essay, and by the way, I think one should say right away that one ought to be grateful to Huntington, not only because he provides one with lecture topics, that's silly, but also because it's certainly stimulating to thought, and it does raise the question. He isn't really entirely wrong. That is to say, there is a lot of evidence around that suggests that the world is divided into warring camps now, and people think of themselves as besieged by X and dominated by Y and threatened by A, and so on and so forth. And all of these things are kinds of abstractions. But I don't think that a lot of the interest taken in his essay, it should be noted, derives from its timing, rather than exclusively from what it says. And also from the sense of confusion and insecurity that people feel after the end of the Cold War. As Huntington himself notes, there have been several intellectual and political attempts since the end of the Cold War to map the emerging world situation. This included Francis Fukuyama's notion of the end of history, which is about the shortest-lived theory that had its day, ever. And the thesis, nobody talks about that anymore, not even Fukuyama, I gather. Because obviously history didn't end. And then another such theory, which was put about during the latter days of the Bush administration, which is the theory of the so-called New World Order, which turns out to be pretty much the same as the Old World Order. But more recently, some historians and polemicists, I'm thinking here of Paul Kennedy, Eric Hobsbawm, who are historians, and Conor Cruiser-Bryant, who's a polemicist, all of whom have looked at the approaching millennium, and we are getting to the end of the second millennium, and have done so with considerable attention to the causes of future conflict, which has given them all cause for alarm. I mean, there's no doubt in anybody's mind, I mean, to be serious for a moment, that the world seems to be tending towards unexpected and quite violent conflagrations that might, in an unpredictable way, break out. The core of Huntington's vision, not really original with him, by the way, is the idea of an unceasing clash, a concept of conflict which slides somewhat effortlessly into the political space vacated by the bipolar war of ideas and values embodied in the unregretted Cold War. I don't, therefore, think it's inaccurate to suggest that what Huntington provides in his essay, especially since it's addressed not to people like us, but to the influential opinion policymakers who subscribe to Foreign Affairs, which is the country's leading journal of foreign policy discussion. What he provides in his essay is a recycled version of the Cold War thesis that conflicts in today's and tomorrow's world will remain not economic or social in essence, but ideological. And if that is so, then, one ideology, that of the West, is the still point or locus around which, for Huntington, all the others turn. In effect, then, the Cold War continues, but this time on many fronts, with many more serious and basic systems of values and ideas like Islam and Confucianism, struggling for ascendancy and even dominance over the West. Not surprisingly, therefore, Huntington concludes his essay with a brief survey of what it is that the West... By the way, it's extremely odd to keep talking about things like the West or Islam as if they were people or committees or somebody that you can actually point to and say, well, that's it. But I mean, this idea of the West, as if the West was one thing, runs through his essay. And as I say, I find it very difficult to sort of put down. But he says what the West must do to remain strong and keep its opponents weak and divided. It must, he says, and I quote now, it must exploit differences and conflicts among Confucian and Islamic states to support in other civilizations groups sympathetic to Western values and interests. The West must strengthen international institutions that reflect and legitimate Western interests and values, and it must promote the involvement of non-Western states in those institutions. Now, so strong and insistent is Huntington's notion that other civilizations necessarily clashed with the West, and so relentlessly aggressive and chauvinistic is his prescription for what the West must do to continue winning, that we're forced to conclude that he's really most interested in continuing and expanding the Cold War by other means, rather than advancing ideas about understanding the current world scene or trying to reconcile between cultures. Little in what he says expresses the slightest doubt or skepticism. Not only will conflict continue, but, he says on the first page, conflict between civilizations will be the latest phase in the evolution of conflict in the modern world. It is, I think, as a very brief and rather crudely articulated manual in the art of maintaining a wartime status in the minds of Americans and others that Huntington's essay has to be understood. I'd go so far as saying that it argues from the standpoint of Pentagon planners and defense industry executives who may have temporarily lost their occupations after the end of the Cold War, but have now discovered a new vocation for themselves. And indeed, of course, the military budget this year has gone up, even though there's no Soviet Union to worry us. Huntington, at least, has the merit of underlining the cultural component in relationships between different countries, traditions, and peoples. The sad part is that the clash of civilizations idea is useful as a way of exaggerating and making intractable various political or economic problems. It's quite easy to see how, for instance, the practice of Japan bashing in the West can be fueled by appeals to the menacing and sinister aspects of Japanese culture as employed by government spokespersons, or how the age-old appeal to the yellow peril might be mobilized for use in discussions in Washington or New York or London of ongoing problems